Friends, this is a re-recording of this morning's sermon as my phone ran out of storage in the middle of preaching this morning. So I am back to do it a second time. So this will not be exactly what folks heard this morning, but it'll be close. Will you pray with me? Let the words of my mouth and the meditations of our hearts be acceptable in thy sight, O God. Let the words of my mouth and the meditations of our hearts be acceptable in thy sight, O God. Amen. I have always been a nature lover. My parents were not particularly outdoorsy. We didn't really go hiking or camping or anything I didn't get to go camping until I was in Girl Scouts a little later. And I grew up in a town that started rural. Our address was rural Route 5 rather than our street name. But it quickly grew into a suburban or bedroom community. I do remember some point in my childhood, they announced that I think we were one of the top 10 fastest growing towns in the state. But the woods on our 1-acre property, as well as bits of nature that I found in the neighborhood, frogs in construction catch pools, open views from a road in a new development, were my retreat from a home where my strong, passionate, but anxious nature often butted up against my father's. The woods were my sanctuary. I would go back there and walk across fallen birch logs and sit and watch the leaves and the sun filter through the trees and just sit and think. They were my solace, my retreat. I also always had a sense of justice about the environment. I grew up in the 80s and 90s where we learned about recycling and the ozone layer, don't use aerosol hairspray on those bangs, and saving the whales in school, but it never really went much deeper than that. I have carried that love of the natural world into adulthood, no matter the place I call home. In fact, there was one time where I called in late to work when I was living in New York City because during my early morning walk in Central Park, I had found an abandoned baby squirrel. And so I took it back to my apartment and warmed it up a bit, but I had to wait for the animal control officer to get into the office. And of course, the animal control officer pretty much just laughed at me because it was only a squirrel after all. But I took the squirrel back to Central Park and placed it under a tree, and it was squeaking, and I was confident that the squeaking would alert the mom and the mom would find the baby just fine. And so it is no accident that I ended up here in Hancock in this place of so much natural beauty. When I was younger, I came here first a couple times on church retreat. A couple of our church members owned a home on Elmwood, South Elmwood, Elmwood Station. And so we were offered a space for the congregation to come and spend a day sort of in this natural beauty and, be with each other and do workshops and such. But it was October, so particularly beautiful and just a gorgeous spot that I fell in love with. And then when Matt and I were making our decision to move and find a new place, we picked our property specifically because it has water. There are places on the property where water just bubbles right up through the ground when it's particularly wet. And it has enough land that we can garden and grow things and hopefully share that in the future with community and friends. We were thinking about climate change. And when I was a kid, emphasis was on saving the earth for the future. Well, we are the future. And all indications are we have failed mightily at heeding the warnings of the last 50 years or so. We are no longer waiting to see the effects of climate change. We are living them out. wildfires far away which cloud our skies with smoke, extreme weather events that send us into deep Arctic freezes in February, dump 40 inches of snow in March, and hit 90 degrees in May. Noticeable shifts in seasonal patterns which push out the formation of ice on our bodies of water later and later each year. And that's just the last 6 months. The reality is, whatever they predicted, it's worse. Whatever we imagine will happen will be worse and faster. Every time the IPCC, that's the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change report, comes out, it's worse than expected. Dire crisis now. This has actually led to the coining of a new term, eco-grief, which describes our anxiety and sorrow at the changes that climate change has made and the destruction of our environments and the trauma that is happening in our world. So we are in the midst of a multi-week sermon series on our Be the Church banner, which is hanging on the front of the vestry. And this week is Protect the Environment. Now, I take issue with that phrase, actually, because it reinforces the dichotomy of human and environment. The fact is, we are the environment, and the environment is us. We can't go back to nature. We are nature. And in fact, scientists have shown that we share up to 50% of our DNA with trees and differing percentages with other creatures and species. Perhaps that is why our bodies respond so well to being outside. In Japan, they practice something called forest bathing, which is pretty much just going for a walk in the woods and being surrounded by the trees. And they have shown that it can decrease blood pressure, slows our respiration, and has a myriad of other health benefits the longer we spend outdoors. Of course, this is assuming in clean, fresh air. Now, my issues with the phrase aside, it is an issue we need to tackle. And there is hope in the face of such dire predictions and news, but it takes action. And there are two aspects and avenues I'd like us to consider in this. The first, on a large scale, forget save the earth. The earth will survive. Humans, and probably many other species, won't. But before that moment comes, years, maybe centuries, maybe just decades of catastrophe will occur. Remember, climate change is a justice issue, not just for plants and bees and the oceans, but for humans, and especially for humans on the margins of society. The poor, BIPOC, developing nations, etc. Brazilian environmental activist Chico Mendes said, "Ecology without class struggle is just gardening." The poor, who, by the way, worldwide contribute the least to climate change, are vastly more impacted by its effects. And climate change will, in itself, cause more poverty. Even in our country, consider the injustices. Where are the industrial facilities? Who lives in the neighborhoods with heavy trucking that pour toxins into the air? Consider the water in Flint, Michigan. Or a little bit closer to home in Western New York, where there is fracking and people can literally light the water that comes out of their faucets on fire. Or even closer to home, here in New Hampshire, where there are dumps. Now, we don't call our local transfer station the dump anymore. Well, some of us maybe still do. But that trash that we bring there, it has to go somewhere. And where does it go? Usually up north, where there is much more poverty than there is down here. And in fact, they are right now discussing putting a new dump up there. And even our neighbors who put more strict rules on their trash don't always keep it there. For instance, Massachusetts recently passed a no textiles rule. You can't throw textiles, mattresses, blankets, stuff like that in the garbage. So what happens when people do it anyway and their trash is contaminated and can't be disposed of in Massachusetts? It comes here to New Hampshire. And who feels the effects of those things? Excuse me. Climate migration, another new term, is a thing and is already happening. And we're going to be a hot spot for climate refugees here in New England, where predictions are that we will feel the effects of climate change a little less. There will be less drought, less flooding. We don't have much we don't have much coastline here in New Hampshire, so there is less concern there. And we're going to be a little bit more stable. We're already seeing that. People are already moving here from places out west where there's drought or wildfires. And the ones that are coming now, they have money. Takes immense privilege to be able to move away from a place that is toxic or unsafe or unstable or potentially going to be so, to somewhere that is more safe and more healthy. Just look at the real estate prices now in New Hampshire. The people who are moving here are not the poor. I read a story about some folks in Jakarta, Indonesia. Jakarta is currently the capital, and it is sinking. And so they are planning on moving Jakarta, the capital, to another island, and they're building a city from scratch. So there's going to be more pedestrian access and a lot more eco-friendly options and considerations. But the thing is, they're not going to move the people. And there's a woman there who I think was in her 30s. And when she was a child, where she lived was at the coast. There was beach not too far away from her home. Where she lives now, same place, is just across the street from a large cement wall, 7 or 8 feet tall, which keeps having to be added to because the water is lapping right at the top of the wall, just feet from where she lives. She cannot move. She does not have the resources to be able to pick up and move her family and away from her support system to find somewhere else to be. That water is going to continue to creep up and encroach on those neighborhoods. Where will they go? We need to consider how our actions, our small little, using reusable rather than disposable, recycling, using less plastic, buying organic, etc., and those of large corporations and conglomerates, which make much bigger impacts on climate change, affect not only us in our tiny little ideal beautiful spot here in Hancock and the Monadnock region, but worldwide. When we do bring our trash and recyclables to the transfer station, where do they go? That being said, our second consideration might be on the much smaller scale. Maybe a tiny patch can start a movement and make a difference. Mary Reynolds, who is an Irish author and landscape designer, and created a movement called We Are the ARK, A-R-K, which stands for Acts of Restorative Kindness. She was in her home one day and happened to look out the window and see a fox going by. And then she saw a couple rabbits a few minutes later. And a few minutes after that, she looked and she saw a little family of hedgehogs. And she realized that in letting some of her garden grow and just be wild, she was welcoming back in species that had left previously. And so her idea is rewilding. move away from gardens. And again, remember, she's a landscape designer. This was her job. But away from gardens and to let nature back in. She wants people to be guardians, not gardeners. And I love this because in listening to our text from Genesis this morning, which has this sort of uncomfortable message of dominion and subdue the earth, if we just shift that to an idea of, rather than dominion, we have guardianship over creation. I think it is a much more proper way to think of it. And in fact, Mary, I believe it was Mary who talked about, when I listened to her as a guest on a podcast, she talked about how humans are the only ones who are sort of separate from the food web and the existence web in the world. We are separate from the rest of creation, but we can be so in a way that doesn't cause harm and in fact improves the lives of the rest of creation around us. So her idea is to take half of our garden or our lawn or our property and just let it go wild. Let it grow back. And if it has been damaged too much, to add native species to improve the soil and improve the conditions, but mostly just let it go back. And she suggests that perhaps we might want to put out a sign stating what we're doing, saying we are building an ark and here's what it is, so that we can avoid scorn. Here in Hancock, we don't really have homeowners associations, but there are other places that do, and just people might sort of look askance at your wild-looking lawn and wonder what might be happening. And so this not only informs them to prevent that sort of shunning in the community, but also to help maybe encourage them to join the same movement. And then she suggests that on the other half, that we don't let go wild, we grow food for ourselves or others to sell or give. Now, she's not against flowers and beauty, but she just thinks so much of our land has been taken for that. She reminds people that while flowers are beneficial to pollinators, native pollinators need native species to, which I love what she said, there have been thousands of years of evolving together in a very specific relationships. And if we remove that relationship, we cause harm. Sort of like, where we learned that the monarch, it's wonderful that if monarchs have lots of flowers to sip from, but if they don't have milkweed specifically, they cannot grow, because milkweed is the only plant on which they lay their eggs and which the caterpillars eat. So these important relationships, and I think it's great that our local library, public library here, is putting in a native pollinator garden. And we might consider doing that somewhere too, or a little garden bed maybe out front. What she says, it's not just about rewilding and restoring our less destructive past. We need to restore our missing future. And I love that. And this is her suggestion for one way to do that on our little patch of land. And she encourages even people with just a balcony to just grow a little wildness there. News and reality are dire and distressing, yes. But we are followers of a God who says that death does not have the last word. A God who created over billions of years this incredible planet that we inhabit, and who for some reason invited us to be guardians and co-creators. Perhaps that was a mistake. We've not done a great job so far. But if we recognize that the key to our own redemption is the restoration, rehabilitation, and deep respect of the rest of creation, there is hope. The second passage we heard this morning, after the sixth day, was from Job. Now, the book of Job is considered by scholars to be the oldest book in the Bible, about 400 years older than Genesis, which means that since the very beginnings of our faith tradition, we've been directed to listen to creation around us and see the glory of the divine in the natural world. German theologian Meister Eckhart, who was a mystic who lived in the late 1200s and early 1300s, believed that every single creature is full of God and is a book of God. He wrote, "If I spend enough time with the tiniest creature, even a caterpillar, I would never have to prepare a sermon. So full of God is every creature." I would extend that beyond creatures to include every plant and fungus and bacteria, even as St. Francis did to rocks and water and others, fire, air. So this past Lent, we focused on creation care for the whole of Lent, and my fast was I fasted from single-use plastic, or tried to. It's actually really, really difficult to fast from single-use plastic in our society today. And that was based on a challenge that has been happening the last few years called Plastic Free July, where this idea for the month of July you don't use single-use plastics. For plastic is one of the worst offenders in pollution and climate change, and they have found that we even have plastic in our bloodstream now. So my challenge for each of you is to come up with your own plan or challenge for July. Now, I know it's only mid-June, not even quite mid-June, but a lot of these take planning and preparation. So maybe you want to create an ark in your yard or garden. Maybe you want to try doing plastic-free July. Maybe you want to take specific actions for justice. Plan a reading list to read up on native species or rewilding. Mary Reynolds has a book on building an ark, on her movement of building an ark. That might be a good one. Maybe you want to brainstorm how the church can take action in these movements and become more climate friendly and more active in climate justice. Maybe you just want to plan on spending an hour or more outside each day, just as part of God's creation. I don't know. The field is wide open for you to get creative and think about how you might want to do this and make plans for how that's going to happen in the next couple weeks. We are the creators of this mess that we are in. We are also the hope for its solution. Taking action in this way, doing some of these things, just being more aware, are all ways that we continue to be the church outside. Amen.